Right, so the BBC has done it again, it seems. You can always tell when Washington is gearing up for something ugly because the BBC suddenly discovers a new expert who, surprise, surprise, sounds like they're telling you exactly what the US State Department wants you to hear. And this time, of course, it's Venezuela in the crosshairs, isn't it? The BBC quietly wheeling out an analyst whose organisation literally takes hundreds of thousands of dollars from the same US government, now escalating military operations in the Caribbean. No disclosure, no context, just the usual polite fiction that this is impartial journalism instead of what seems like the warm-up act for whatever the White House decides to do next. And while American officials are out there reportedly ordering troops to kill everybody on a fishing boat, the BBC is busy smoothing the narrative so Britain won't ask too many questions when the next phase arrives. Right, so you can tell when the British state's getting ready to look the other way for whatever Washington does next, because the BBC suddenly discovers a new expert who speaks with the full confidence of impartial analysis while carrying the assumptions of US foreign policy like it's part of their bloodstream. And that's exactly what's happening now with Venezuela, because this whole story didn't begin with a government statement or a debate in Parliament or even an announcement from the White House. It begins with a tweet. And it's not a tweet from an official, but from an investigative journalist who knows exactly how media power works, Matt Kennard of Declassified UK. You see, Matt was watching BBC World News when it interviewed a chap called Jeremy McDermott, co-director of Insight Crime, about the situation in the Caribbean. Insight Crime themselves had posted the clip proudly, showing McDermott explaining how US anti-drug operations have disrupted cocaine routes and how, in his framing, the Maduro government is sustained by state-embedded criminal structures. On the surface, it looked like standard foreign desk material. Expert, map, analysis, done. Next story. But Kennard did what the BBC refused to do. He pointed out the fact that breaks the entire illusion of BBC neutrality, in fact. Insight Crime, the outlet being treated as an independent analytical authority, receives significant funding from the US government, including the State Department, and not in a token way either, in a way that certainly could be seen as shaping how the organisation operates. According to Kennard in his tweet, they took close to $700,000 from Washington in the past year. That's the same State Department whose strategic interests the BBC segment just happened to reinforce. And in the clip, not a single mention of that funding, no disclosure, nothing. And this is the exact point where journalism ends and manufacturing consent begins, because the BBC didn't platform a neutral observer. It platformed an analyst whose organisation is funded by the very government escalating operations around Venezuela, and then presented him as if he were offering dispassionate expertise. The audience is told, here's the situation, here is the crime network, here is the instability, and here, conveniently, is the American frame already built into the analysis. What the audience is not told is, this expert's organisation is paid by the state that wants you to see Venezuela as a threat. And McDermott himself isn't the issue. His work exists. His claims about state-embedded trafficking trace back years. Insight Crime's investigations into the cartel de los Sols are well known in the field. The issue is what happens when the BBC selects him at this particular moment, when the United States is escalating militarily, when the legal rationale is buckling, and when the public narrative must be shaped before the next step is taken. And once you understand that sequence, the BBC's omission, if we can call it that, stops looking like an oversight and starts looking like something with structural effects. Because silence is not neutral, it's structural. Because look at the moment this happens. You have reporting right now that a senior American official, Pete Hegseth, allegedly told his forces to kill everybody aboard a Venezuelan fishing vessel, then authorised a second attack on the survivors. You have the president's spokesperson, Caroline Leavitt, unable to explain how this is lawful under any recognised standard when put on the spot at a subsequent presser. You have a regional operation expanding faster than the legal or diplomatic cover surrounding it. In any sane media environment, the story would be, why is the United States using force like this, and what is the legal justification? But in the BBC's world, the framing becomes Venezuela is criminal, US operations disrupt trafficking, the instability is structural, and the escalation is contextual, not political. That's not journalism. That's narrative management. And when you widen the lens, the shape becomes even clearer, because the BBC is not acting alone. It never does. Look at how the wider media ecosystem has responded. Take the Murdoch-owned Wall Street Journal suddenly pushing a piece describing how Venezuelan gangs and African jihadists are supposedly flooding Europe with cocaine. The language is familiar to anyone who lived through 2002. A murky foreign threat, criminality bleeding into extremism, and a dangerous and unpredictable regime at the centre of it all. Boo hiss. You could replace the country name with Iraq, and the paragraphs would barely change, would they? That's not a coincidence. That's how threat inflation works when a state is preparing its moral justification for escalation. And then you have the ideological ecosystem in the US doing its part. Right-wing commentators defending the kill order reporting, saying things so extreme the administration doesn't even try to stand behind them. A White House spokesperson visibly out of her depth when asked to defend that second strike, though in fairness, Leavitt would be out of her depth in a bird bath, wouldn't she? The atmosphere shifting from policing to warfare without the public ever getting a moment to understand what changed. When the institutional message is falling apart, the media message hardens to compensate. And that again is where the BBC steps in. Not as the loudest voice, not as the most ideological one either, but as the respectable British centre, the part of the machine that smooths out the narrative so escalation feels less like a choice and more like an inevitability. And this is why Kennard's tweet hits like it does. It's why it struck me so much when I came across it, that I built this entire video out of it, basically. Because it made visible the thing the BBC has spent decades pretending doesn't exist. It showed that expert selection is not a neutral process. It showed that funding is not an irrelevant footnote when it comes to the BBC bringing on guests they cite as relevant and informed opinion. And perhaps it's more blatant when you look at shows like Question Time. But it counts everywhere. It shows that at the precise moment Washington needed the narrative to tighten around Venezuela, the BBC delivered a segment that looked remarkably aligned with what the US government would likely prefer the public here to hear. Not because anyone scripted it, but because the BBC's editorial culture already leans that way. And at this point, you have to name the institutional pattern, because this didn't start with Venezuela. The BBC did this with Iraq when it repeated government claims about weapons while suppressing internal scepticism. It did this with Libya when it framed intervention as humanitarian inevitability. It did this with Yemen when it broadcast a version of the war that removed Britain's fingerprints almost entirely. It's done it repeatedly in Gaza, where the broadcaster has issued corrections only after the damage to public understanding is already done. The BBC always insists it is impartial, but impartiality inside the BBC has never meant neutrality. It's meant accepting the worldview of Western power as the baseline from which all their journalism is done. And that worldview is rigid. When the United States frames a foreign state as criminal, the BBC almost always follows. When the United States exaggerates a threat, the BBC almost always amplifies. When the United States starts shifting towards physical action, the BBC starts smoothing the ground. Because once you understand that pattern, the Venezuela coverage stops being an isolated lapse and becomes the opening act of a familiar script. The BBC didn't just bring on McDermott, it brought on a framing that Venezuela is a criminalised state, that instability radiates outwards from it, that American operations emerge from necessity rather than strategy, and the omission of the US funding behind this platform isn't a side issue. It comes across as an omission that has the effect of delivering political work without ever admitting that it is doing political work. Disclosure would have forced the audience to interrogate the analysis given. Omission allows the analysis instead to become common sense. And here's the part that matters most here in Britain. The BBC isn't viewed as just another outlet. It is perceived as the voice that tells people the world as it is, not as someone wants it to be. And that's why omissions are so corrosive, because when the BBC chooses a frame, it becomes the frame for millions of people who don't have the time or the inclination to interrogate the politics that might be behind it. And that makes the BBC the perfect delivery mechanism for escalation narratives, polite, calm, authoritative, and structurally aligned with the assumptions of the state. So let's be clear here, the assumptions embedded in this coverage are carrying the United States across the line from interdiction to open violence. You have a military action that, based on the reporting, appears difficult to reconcile with principles of proportionality and distinction under international humanitarian law. You have a political environment where lethal force is defended not with argument, but with evasion. You have a president whose spokesperson cannot justify what has happened, and you have a British broadcaster that chooses to focus not on those failures, but on a criminological narrative that portrays Venezuela as the kind of state where such force feels understandable, even necessary. Now imagine the inverse for a minute. Imagine if Venezuelan forces had fired on an American boat and then on survivors in the water. Imagine if the Venezuelan government refused to justify the strike. Imagine if commentators aligned with Caracas defended the killings as necessary. Imagine if a Venezuelan broadcaster platformed an expert on US organised crime, whose organisation was funded by the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry and failed to mention it. The BBC would treat every one of those facts as proof of Venezuela's lawlessness, wouldn't it? But when the roles reverse, the BBC treats reported American actions as context and not evidence. And this asymmetry is the heart of the problem. It's why Kennard's tweet was so necessary and so striking. It's why the omission was so revealing. Because the BBC isn't just failing to disclose, it's failing to recognise that disclosure is necessary. It doesn't think US funding matters because it doesn't see the US as a political actor in the same way it sees an unaligned state. The BBC assumes the United States has interests, yes, but not motives. It assumes the United States has strategies, but not agendas. It assumes the United States has adversaries, but not ambitions. That's the worldview you get when you spent decades acting as a megaphone for a state whose power shapes your own government's foreign policy. And the timing could not be more convenient for Washington, because the escalatory narrative is already gaining traction. The Wall Street Journal story about Venezuelan networks flooding Europe mirrors the old WMD pipeline framing used to sell the Iraq invasion, an implied but never substantiated linkage between a foreign government and a distant threat. You have commentators treating Venezuelan fishermen as combatants. You have the US president's own staff floundering when asked to explain basic legality. And you have the BBC, the most respectable outlet in Britain, quietly reinforcing the premise that Venezuela is the destabilising force in the region. This is how escalation becomes thinkable before any formal announcement, before any parliamentary debate, before the public even realises something's actually happening here. It starts with a pattern of stories that all point in the same direction. Venezuela is criminal. Venezuela is unstable. Venezuela threatens regional stability. The United States is responding. The United States has no choice. And the BBC presents this pattern as though it is simply what the evidence shows, when in reality it's the product of editorial selection, expert curation, and the quiet absence of information that would complicate the picture. It's not that the BBC is inventing things, it's not doing that. It's that it is refusing to name the political stakes of the things it chooses to show. And because Britain has outsourced its foreign policy imagination to the United States for decades, the BBC treats US perspectives as the natural starting point for understanding the world. That is why the omission of Insight Crime's funding is so revealing. It tells you what the BBC doesn't see, or tells you that the BBC doesn't see the US government as a stakeholder in the story, even when the US government is actually driving the escalation. And once you accept that, everything else follows. Britain will not question the legality of US actions. It will not question the necessity of the operations. It will not challenge the American framing of Venezuela. And the BBC will lead the public down that path long before any minister stands up to speak. Not because it is told to, and not because it wants to, but because the institution has been trained by its history, by its political environment, by its professional culture, to treat Western power as neutral ground. And when you look at the bigger picture, the BBC is not the only part of this machine, but it's the part that matters most in Britain. Because there are two kinds of propaganda in Western foreign policy. There's the loud frothing kind that comes from the fringes, your GBBs, the pundit shouting that the fishermen should be killed, the commentator reducing a sovereign state to a criminal hive. That stuff prepares the culture war base, of course. But the propaganda that lands with the general public comes from the polite centre, from calm presenters, from authoritative voices, from institutions that insist they are above the fray. And that's the space the BBC occupies. And that is why its emissions are never neutral. They're the quiet engineering of public consent. And the BBC knows the power of omission. It used omission to frame Iraq. It used omission to sanitise Britain's role in Yemen. It used omission when it refuses to refer to Gaza as a genocide. Omission is how the BBC often functions to protect the worldview of the state while maintaining the appearance of independence. It doesn't have to lie. It just needs to decide which parts of the truth matter. And in the Venezuela coverage, the funding behind the analysis didn't matter to them because they didn't see it as political. But of course it's political. It is structurally, materially political. And the BBC chose not to see it, because to see it would be to recognise its own role in the story. The United States is escalating militarily while failing to justify its actions legally. Senior American officials are reportedly using language that collapses the distinction between combatants and civilians. The administration is floundering when pressed on legality. The narrative foundations are fragile. And what does the BBC do? It inserts itself right where Washington needs it, providing a criminological explanation for Venezuelan instability that, when stripped of the funding context, looks like neutral expertise rather than a perspective aligned with US strategic interests. And this is how escalation becomes morally tolerable. Before a single British politician opens their mouth, before a single public debate is held, before anyone has had time to think through the consequences of being aligned with a US president whose own staff cannot justify his military actions. The public is handing a version of Venezuela that makes American escalation look like the natural and even responsible response. And the BBC delivers this version without once acknowledging that the expert explaining the situation receives money from the state doing the escalating. And the most striking thing is that the BBC doesn't even think it's doing anything unusual. It just thinks that this is what journalism looks like. It thinks expertise is something you measure by tone rather than by funding, by fluency rather than by independence. It thinks neutrality is a matter of presentation rather than structural alignment. And because it believes all of this sincerely, it's become one of the most effective tools for smoothing the public into acquiescence before a foreign policy turn. And here's why this moment is dangerous. Britain is being led quietly, gradually, atmospherically into accepting an American framing of Venezuela at the very moment when that framing is doing the political work of pre-justifying force. The escalation has already begun, the legality is already collapsing, the rhetoric is already slipping into the unacceptable, and the media ecosystem, from the sensationalist fringes to the respectable centre, is making sure the public understands this story from Washington outward, not from Caracas outward, not from international law outward, and not from basic morality outward. The public deserves the truth that the BBC did not disclose the funding, that the analysis was therefore not neutral, that the wider media environment is building a case for escalation, that the American government is behaving in ways that demand scrutiny rather than acceptance, and that Britain, once again, is being eased into alignment with a foreign policy position without any democratic debate. And this is the verdict. The BBC has not committed a technical error. It has not made a simple oversight. It has done what it always does when Western power moves towards confrontation. It's selected the expert whose framing serves the moment. It has omitted the context that would expose the alignment. And it has presented the resulting narrative as the reasonable centre ground view. It's done work that helps prepare the public to see Venezuela through Washington's eyes. And unless people recognise that this is not impartiality, but manufacturing consent in its most polished form, Britain will once again find itself complicit in a foreign policy it never chose, guided there by a broadcaster whose editorial decisions still carry more political weight than it ever acknowledges. And quite simply, the message from all of us to the BBC is that once again, we see you. And of course, it was only last month that the BBC found itself in another public mess, wasn't it? One that ended with several senior figures stepping down, a story I've already covered in full, of course, with the receipts. If you missed that one, you can catch it here. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next one. Cheers, folks.